Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Moods, Minds, and Manifestations podcast, featuring real people, real experiences, and real talk. And I'm your host, Moca. So let's get into it. Today's topic is homeschooling, and my guest today is Cheryl Trzasko, who I have known for many years and, in my opinion, is an expert on the topic. So, welcome, Cheryl. I'm happy to have you here today, and I hope people will find this discussion informative.
Thank you.
So, my first question to you is, how and when did you get involved with homeschooling?
Well, I actually was homeschooled as a child. So that's the first I came across it. When I was a child, my family sailed on a yacht that my dad built. We sailed from Australia around Indonesia, over towards Africa, and so on, eventually landing in the United States. And obviously there are no schools out in the middle of the ocean. They had hired a teacher to come with us as a crew member, and that teacher enjoyed her vacation and never even talked to me.
Oh, wow.
So eventually my mother was like, well, I can do better than somebody who does nothing. And that's where it began.
So your family, you're American?
Yes, my family was originally from the United States. Two of my sisters were born in Australia. So we had a family that was a mixture of American and Australians.
Okay. So I know you personally because my kids were homeschooled, and that was my first experience with homeschooling through your group. So can you tell our listeners what's the name of the homeschooling group and your role in the group?
So I run a local homeschool group called Palm Beach County Homeschoolers. It's a local homeschool support group. Basically, it is a place that parents can bring their children for informal get-togethers at parks so the children can make friends, they can play, the adults can talk, help each other figure out how they're homeschooling. Sometimes there will be more formal events at those park days, but there are also more formal events. Some people will organize field trips or clubs or even classes. They might be classes that meet, say, once a week or once a month, but they're all opportunities for the children to engage with other children and share different parents' expertise and make homeschooling more social. And I've run that group since 2009, although the group has been around since 1993.
Wow. And just from my experience with the group, my children and I found it very enjoyable. There were quite a mix of different people from different backgrounds, from different cultures. So we definitely got a really good cross-section of people there to intermingle with and learn from and socialize with. How many members do you have in the group currently, approximately?
Well, like many things, COVID has impacted our group. So right now we have about 70 families.
Okay.
We used to have a lot that we're rebuilding.
And the kids, from what I remember, are all different age groups. And what I found really, really fun and fascinating was you'd have a teenager, maybe high school age, playing with a toddler, somebody that's, much, much younger. And they got along so beautifully because it was really just more about socializing and being around like-minded people and learning. What would you say are the main reasons people homeschool their children?
The reasons vary great. For some people, it is because of issues at a school. Maybe their children were bullied and the administration doesn't do anything about it. Some homeschool because of health issues, especially during COVID. A lot of people said it's better to just, since we're staying home anyway, just do our own thing and not have to worry about if they get people back to school soon or something, or maybe my child's immune level is compromised and I don't need them there or someone else in the family. It can also be issues about academics. The level of academics has gone down a great deal. And also there are children who may have special needs and they're not quite at the same level as their peers. And the families want to help their children, whether their children are advanced or behind. Children of that age, they want to help them do their best at whatever level the child is at, and not that they have to keep up with the rest.
Right.
Some people do it for reasons of faith. They may feel that the schools are undermining their values and such, and that happens on both extremes, whether you have very religious people or very secular people. It happens both ways.
Right. And for me personally, I homeschool because my family, we traveled a lot overseas, and it was just when it came time for the kids to go to regular school, we were traveling so much that I just felt it was just better to not interrupt our traveling and not interrupt their schooling. So we were very happy when we found the group, and it's really been a lifesaver for us. Yeah, so there are so many different reasons. It was interesting before the COVID pandemic. I often got a lot of side eyes for homeschooling because people just generally didn't understand, especially when we traveled overseas, and I wanted to get my kids more involved in the regular or the local schools when we traveled. And in the beginning, I got a lot of side eyes, but then lo and behold, COVID came and it became the norm for everyone. So there's a lot to be said about homeschooling and the benefits of it, definitely. If I remember correctly, the homeschool group that you're in charge of is kind of different from a lot of the other homeschool groups out there. I remember some were more religious. What are the types of homeschool groups that are out there, just so our listeners can know maybe one or the other might work better for them?
So yes, our group is, we call it an inclusive group. We are not faith-based. We're not against faith. That's not our focus. So we have people of all different religious backgrounds, secular backgrounds, whatever. We're more interested in education. There are quite a few homeschool groups that are faith-based and maybe run by a particular church or other religious group. I mean, I've seen them for a variety of religions. So those are definitely an option.
Right.
There are some groups that are more formal and are more like a mini school, but it might only meet 1 day a week as opposed to a 5 day a week thing.
Okay.
The parents may be the teachers, or they might hire teachers, and then they will be given assignments to do the rest of the week while the parents work with the children at home. So that's another option.
Your group is more focused on the socialization and information aspect of it versus actually doing lessons. Correct?
We have a variety of things. So, for example, yes, we have a lot of social things, but we have things like science fairs. We have a geography history fair each year. We have a talent show. We have a variety of classes that different parents put together. So, for example, I'm currently running a class called Physics with Legos and Other Toys that meets just once a week with various families, and we're studying science, but we make it fun.
Right.
And classes for drama and writing and various other subjects. They're less formal, though. They're not giving report cards or grades. They are something that parents typically do.
In addition.
Whatever.
But it's really the parents' responsibility to make sure what the child is learning, correct?
Correct. In Florida law, which is where I'm at, part of the definition of home education is that the parent directs the learning. So they might be doing all the teaching themselves. They might be outsourcing to various people, online programs, homeschool groups, whatever. But the parent is still the one who is considered to be the director and has to make sure that the children are being educated and that records are being kept.
Right. And can anyone homeschool technically? Like, you don't have to have a background in education. Any parent can choose to homeschool their child, correct?
So the laws vary from place to place. In most places in the United States, anyone can homeschool, although in some states it's easier if you have teacher training. In Florida, it doesn't matter. Anyone can do it. And there's been a lot of research that I've read over the years that shows that people without teaching backgrounds often do a better job of it than those with teaching backgrounds, part because those who've learned to teach have learned to teach in a more rigid way, where they don't really pay attention to what the child needs to learn and how the child learns. They just have a plan and go with it.
Okay.
Whereas homeschooling, it works so much better if you pay attention to what your child's needs are and adjust the learning to fit your child's needs. The learning more efficient, and the child fights less, will enjoy it more, especially if you make sure to involve their interests.
And it's possible too that even in one family, you could have one child that learns a certain way, and then the other child or other children, they have other needs. So, it might be very different within one family. So,
Right.
What do you think, if you were to pick a topic or two, would be the most necessary thing for homeschooling to be successful, regardless of family or lifestyle or so? What are the key ingredients to making homeschooling successful?
So definitely taking into account your child's preferred method of learning is a key one. Every person has their own way that they learn best. And if you don't fight their nature, but try to teach them in a way that works with how they learn, that will make it so much easier and more efficient. If you use their interests, that can make a huge difference, motivating them to want to learn. For example, my oldest really wanted to learn about Star Wars when he was younger. And I thought, well, that's not very academic.
Right.
But then I found ways to make it academic, and his reading levels shot up once he got to read Star Wars books more and more, because he
wanted to, right.
I found ways to bring other interests in. We looked at science that was in them and whether the science was real or imaginary, or might be real if technology improved. We looked at some of the settings and saw history in there, and so we studied that history. So we brought in as much as we could with that interest, and it made it work much better for him. So anything you can in their interest will definitely help. Those are some key things.
Right.
You can also customize, for example, if your child already knows something very well, there's no need to waste time on lessons that they've already mastered. You can move on to other things. Or if there are things that they struggle with, you can stop and take time and review, go back, help them learn what they need to. So if you customize that way, it makes it a much better education overall.
And it also helps them to learn at their pace. And obviously, if the child is happier learning, the parent is less stressed as well. How would a parent considering homeschooling go about formulating a syllabus for their child?
So one of the things that I recommend people do if they're really serious about homeschooling is to first start off with what's called deschooling. So in deschooling, you don't actually start with a syllabus. You start instead with informal learning, where you might visit places like museums or zoos or historical sites or whatever is available in your area. You might watch documentaries or educational videos of kind. You might read stories together. But one of the things that is important to do is to ask your child to pick something they'd like to study and then let them decide what materials or whatever they will use, and have them make some kind of presentation for you. And the point of this is it helps you figure out, how does this child prefer to learn? If the child likes books and reading them themselves, then that's going to say, oh, well, maybe workbooks and things will work better for this child. Whereas if you have a child who wants to go do things hands-on, go places, or they want to watch videos and find some that help them understand it, it can help direct what kinds of materials you should be considering and what methods. That works better than just starting with planning something without knowing how your child prefers to learn.
Okay, so it's important to figure out what methods work best for them. But what if the parent feels like, I know at one point I felt I didn't want to not have the kids at the level of, their peers in regular school. I wanted them to make sure they had the mathematics, the English, all of that stuff. And I remember just looking online and seeing what all the other kids were learning, or I would ask other parents what types of things the kids were learning so that I could make sure that my kids weren't deficient, so to speak. But it's not really required in homeschooling as far as I remember. But I know there are other parents as myself who felt that, maybe their kids would be deficient if they didn't keep up with what kids in regular school were learning. So
there are lots of websites where you can find out what the local standards are. One that I like for the United States is World Book Encyclopedia. Has what they call typical course of study. If you Google it, under typical course of study, for every grade level, they give what's typically learned at that grade level in the United States.
Okay.
But what I have found over the years is that if you dive immediately into academics, homeschooling doesn't work as well.
Okay, so it's important to figure out what methods work best for them
and work from there. Reason for that is when you do informal learning first, it helps your children see that learning can happen even if you don't look like a school. And so they're less likely to fight you because they're less likely to think that this is a fake school. So it helps get the attitudes right, especially if they've been in a school before. Mm-hmm. A lot of schools unintentionally teach that parents don't know so much. For example, if the parent has learned a different method to do a math problem than is currently taught in the school, and the child brings in some work that they did following the parent's method, a lot of schools will say, oh no, this is no good, even though it's done correctly.
Correctly, right.
They teach the child that mom and dad don't know that much. They are not as smart as the teacher. Mm-hmm. Part of the informal learning is to help them see that mom and dad do know a great deal and can help them learn without having to follow the way the school does things.
Traditional ways. What would you say are some of the misconceptions that people have about homeschooling?
There are quite a few. One is that they're at home all the time. Most homeschoolers that I know are out and about, exposing their children to the community, learning things as parents do errands. They meet people from all spectrums of life in that area. And they usually have better social skills because they learn to talk to adults of different ages, not just children. That's a big one.
Right.
There's also this idea that all homeschoolers are somehow sheltered, never learn anything of the outside world. And unless they are a strange family that never lets their children outside, most homeschooled children get to know the world much better because they're not confined with people their own age for hours a day, which is not something you see in any other time of life. As an adult, you don't find an office where you work with people who are exactly your age.
Right.
You work with people of all ages.
Right. I remember my kids being told once that they're never going to learn enough to get to college. It was a friend of theirs that they had socialized with and did extracurricular activities with. And I had to let the child know that that's definitely not true. And, I gave some examples, and she was enlightened after that. So
I know in our area, a huge percentage of homeschooled children actually take college classes before they graduate high school.
Right.
It's the opposite. And in the United States, most colleges have developed application packets specifically for homeschooled students because they won't have, some of the same things that the school children have. For example, they won't have a guidance counselor separate from their individual subject teachers or something necessarily. So they've set up application packets specifically for them, and they like homeschoolers because they find that they tend to have a more solid foundation.
Right.
For example, if the class says it's time to move on and then just moved on without understanding it, instead, most parents will say, if you don't get this yet, we'll spend more time on it. We'll make sure you understand it. So they tend to come in with a better foundation.
And how would you say is best for a homeschooler to prepare for college, as far as maybe courses and whatever else they might need as far as applications?
Just to get the best education you can. Just keep moving ahead in your core subjects and study without necessarily having it look like school, and still do very well in college. Most students at some point will use study materials that are designed for college entrance exams and that sort of thing. But a lot of it is finding out what the regulations are where you live. I know in Florida, if you homeschool your child to graduation, there's a document that parents are to put together and sign in front of a notary public that's called an affidavit of completion.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's signed and notarized, colleges in this area have to recognize them as high school graduates.
Right. I've done that with my older daughter who is graduated now.
Right.
Yes.
And they found that, homeschooled students do tend to know enough. They are well educated enough that it's not something that they worry about like they might have 3 or 4 decades ago.
So as far as the homeschooling laws, are they homeschooling laws by state, or is there a federal homeschooling law?
In the United States, it's by state. So you definitely have to research how does it work in your state.
And do you know if there's any homeschooling support on a national level?
There are definitely support available. For example, there's an organization called HSLDA, which stands for Homeschool Legal Defense Association, which was formed by lawyers who wanted to homeschool back in the 1980s, when homeschooling was becoming more popular in the United States because of changes in school funding laws and tax laws, and made homeschooling seem like the best alternative for those who didn't like what they saw in the local schools. So HSLDA made sure that homeschooling was legal in all states, and there are many people who join them as members of their group to get some support. But there are lots of websites and groups around that offer support online, many groups that you can join. I would advise joining some that are general, but also some local.
Right.
You definitely want local to help maneuver.
What advice would you give to someone considering homeschooling their child on how to get the process started?
So you definitely want to research your laws. Find a local group that knows your laws and can help you. That's usually the best way, is to find the people who know, because sometimes the way laws are written and the way they are carried out are not necessarily the same. So finding the local experts will help smooth the process.
Right. And I know in Florida, the Department of Education has a section that's dedicated to homeschoolers. I remember at the time I signed up my children or registered my children as homeschooled many years ago, over 10 years ago. They created this office because there were so many new homeschoolers, and they had to have that coverage for all those registrations.
There is a home education department. They used to call it the Office of choice, but now it's just home education. Part of their mission is to oversee how records are collected and such, and to help local school districts know what they are supposed to do in regard to homeschoolers, which is mostly collect records. I run a group besides the local homeschool group mentioned. I run a statewide group for Florida on Facebook that has over 13,000 people in it. And that's a big part of our mission, is to help people who are trying to figure out homeschooling. Local school districts, they often just don't know. They're often not trained on it.
Right. And that's where you come in. Yeah, I've always found your information extremely helpful. What would you say is the minimum responsibility of the parents as far as keeping records or, whatever is legally required, at least for parents in Florida? I remember we had to keep certain coursework to have some kind of proof that the child or the children are learning. And I remember once a year we had to submit an evaluation. Is that still the case?
Correct. So you have to keep 3 kinds of records for Florida. You have to keep some kind of a log of educational activities, so some kind of record showing what is it that children are learning from, one day or week. You have to keep titles of reading materials and then some samples of work. And those documents are meant to prove that your children are not truant. They are getting an education. And there is an annual evaluation, which might be testing. It might be a review of the records you keep. The parent gets to choose what it will look like.
Okay, and then that evaluation is submitted, if I'm not mistaken, it's submitted by the anniversary of the enrollment date every year, just to keep it up to date.
Correct.
Yes, so you also do evaluations.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little about exactly what your evaluation services include?
Okay, so we do portfolio review evaluations, which means parents will show us some of the records they've kept. We usually don't need to see everything because people usually keep a lot more than necessary. We need to see enough to verify that, yes, you have the sorts of documentation you're supposed to, and more importantly, that the child is making educational progress. So they show us records. We then have to talk with the child about it, basically to let the child know how the education is going, since it's their education. And then we provide documentation that the parent can give to the local school district to meet that legal requirement for the evaluation. And if they have questions about, the legal requirement, or just need help figuring out how to work through a certain issue or whatever, we provide a lot of support that way.
Right.
My husband and I both do evaluations because we are both certified teachers who also are homeschool parents.
Okay. All right. I think that is it. We have covered so much information today, and I will include a list of resources that you've mentioned, and maybe any others that you haven't mentioned that you would like to share. We'll include all that in the description section below the podcast. And Cheryl, I thank you so much. This was so informative. A lot of this I personally know because I have homeschooled both of my kids. And I just think it's so important for people to be educated on the ins and outs of homeschooling. There are a lot of misconceptions out there. Cheryl, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to enlighten us. And I wish you a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks. If you haven't already done so, please like and subscribe to hear upcoming podcasts. And please share with family and friends. Thanks for listening.